Hello and welcome back to the Transfer Flow podcast. And on today's episode, we talk about Brentford's early goals. Have they managed to solve football? Then playing out from the back, why have there been so many high turnover goals in the Premier League this season? Before we turn to Bayern, did we call this pot early on their defence? And maybe we'll have time for Spurs or City or anything else as well. But stay tuned. Okay, so we're back for another episode. I'm Patrick Van Straten. You know me by now, and I'm joined by Ted Knutson. Good to see you, Ted.
Hello. You're seeing even more of me. With the light and maybe some glare, but who knows?
I'm seeing you in high res.
We had an entire conversation about makeup before we got started here. We promised that we go faster to start for YouTube. So for those of you who are there, hold on to your attention spans just a little bit longer.
Oh, God. Okay, right. Well, let's get straight into it. So just to let you know, we're not going to recap every Premier League game every week, okay? If you'd like to get the Transfer Flow perspective on all the week's action, then sign up for the newsletter, because there you'll get a roundup. Ted's been beavering away all weekend, so he'll give you his take on all the Premier League matches. But there are several very interesting stories from the weekend that we thought we could dig into here in a bit more detail. So, firstly, Ted, there's a story here that sits at the exact nexus of all your expertise, I think. Brentford's early goals. It's almost like they're approaching kickoff as a kind of set piece, or at least as a structured play.
Right. So I'm going to go through a bit of a story because I think that we have a lot of new people on the podcast who are not necessarily familiar with my history, and in particular not familiar with like what we've done in the area of set pieces. So bear with me for a moment, but the way that you should think of set pieces is you should reterm them as restarts. If you reterm them as restarts, you will start to understand the breadth of what is possible from these particular moments. It's the moments when football starts over again. Mm-hmm. And this is true for men's football and women's football. You have them on throw-ins, which are sort of the lowliest of the restarts. You have them on, any sort of free kick that we start, but really kickoffs are also a free kick. Goal kicks can potentially be one of those, but those are really far away from your own goal. So like not usually much of a chance to get started, potential shots or goals or anything like that. And what it looks like is Brentford have solved the first minute of football. I don't know if that's a possible thing. I don't know if it's a thing that is maintainable, but I think in 4 of their 7 matches so far, they've had a goal effectively in like the first 120 seconds or something like that. Thomas Frank said that they'd been practicing all week to win the coin toss, and failing that, it took them a little bit longer against Wolves to actually score. Thomas is funny, very dry Danish sense of humor. So the idea behind this is it came from Johnny Vio, really, on my side originally. And Johnny Vio now is the coach of set pieces for the United States national team. Prior to that, he was at Spurs. When he came to my attention, he was the guy who helped Fiorentina and Vincenzo Montella's team score 26 goals across a 38-game Serie A season. And I think Horncastle had a story about sort of the set-piece mastermind. The incredible thing is, like, Johnny had been coaching for ages at that point, but he'd been kind of plying his trade as a head coach down in Serie D and stuff like that. So, like, way down in the leagues. Okay. Lovely man. And he found a thing that he knew was advantageous and valuable that nobody had been paying that much attention to. Obviously, it wasn't the first time this had been talked about. I think even Charles Reap had discussions around restarts and stuff like that back in the sort of 80s and 90s. So these are things that have gone through football as like everything has. One of the things Robbie says on different pods is that we've seen everything in the 120 years of football. It's just like what's in fashion now. I think it's bell bottoms if I walk down the street, but no. Okay. So football bell bottoms. That's what we're looking at very soon. In 2014, I was hired by Matthew Benham, who's the owner of Brentford, to come in. And it was really a stats basis to be able to start working on better player recruitment, because they knew that they couldn't put scouts all over the world. So like, how do we find better players if we're little at Brentford? But the first thing they had me work on was a total detour in my life. And he's like, hey, I want you to take 4 to 6 weeks. I want you to look at all the set pieces. We've got a bunch of video here and an archive of teams that are good. We got this book in Italian from this Italian guy named Johnny Vio. We're going to get translated. And I want you to figure out like how to do this better. I'm just like, you what? Matt, I know you got a lot of money, but like I'm a stats nerd. I'm a gambler. I don't have any idea what you're talking about. He's like, no, I think you could do this. Like, go ahead and crack it. It's the most insane thing that anybody's told me to do in a very, very long time. So did that in 2014. And basically what I produced at that point was a set piece playbook. And it wasn't a playbook per se. It was a series of routines along with a series of philosophies to allow people to better break down teams from wide corner or wide free kicks, and partly from deeper free kicks, and certainly from corners. And then eventually we instituted long throws at the particularly in Midtjylland. So all these things add up to one very important, crucial concept. If we can create a couple more goals in a season without having to spend a ton more money, it has a massive amount of value for our one club or our two clubs or our 10 clubs, wherever you're at. So that was what we were looking at from there. And then at some point along the way, we saw the Red Bull teams, who are notorious for really liking to high press aggressively, start to do kind of long kicks. And what they did then was they would basically cede the ball and possession of the ball for territory. They would go in, have a throw in the opponent's own third, and then they would press that aggressively, hopefully win it back, and then go on from there. What it looks like Brentford have done is taken some of that concept and some of the concept that we do, and actually England have done, in past World Cups, which is go from kick, know that you have this one moment where you are going to be able to script something. Like, it's not a real script, but script something. And then see if you can pull off an overload in a space that the opponent isn't necessarily expecting, and then turn that into a good chance. And since you know where you want to put the ball, you have an information advantage versus your opponent. Since you know probably who you think has the height mismatches, like Christopher Ayer has a height and jumping mismatch against most people, but you can create this in the opposition anyway. Since you know those two things, where do we want to play the ball? Who has a mismatch? Then we can create a situation where we have a pressing situation. We close it down quickly. Either we win the first ball from Ayer and he passes it to one of our guys. We win the second ball off of a press because we know where the ball is going to go, so we know how to contain it. And then we quickly break towards the goal. Not all of their, in fact, most of their goals have not been, off of an obvious element of that, but they're getting at teams very quickly. They're making sure that they put attacking pressure on. And then the moment the ball goes out, they sort of revert back to a normal shape and a normal structure until the opportunity arises again. This isn't the first time this has happened, but it's certainly the first time that I've seen it where it has been a consistent form of goal scoring, and teams are aware of it and they're still not able to stop it.
Yeah, so it feels like roughly they've been getting kind of about 4 guys in the box for this first cross that they get, and then somebody drops off towards the penalty spot. And if you've got 4 guys in the box, then chances of an overload are pretty high, right? And then you get stuff like Nathan Collins scoring from open play in the first. What was it? It was like a minute 16 seconds or something.
Buemo has 2 side volleyed goals off of this, which again,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how repeatable it is, but they're perfect left-footed side volleyed goals that go in the top corner.
Yeah, that's the thing. Where I want to praise them for being able to do this, but at the same time, I was kind of like, if this results in Mbeumo having to score an unbelievable volley, I don't know. That does seem like something that could kind of fall apart over time. How sustainable do you think this sort of thing is? Because with other kinds of set pieces, right, you can constantly change your approach. With this, I don't know why I feel this way, but intuitively, it feels like this should be something that teams can adapt to more successfully than just, a free kick from wide of the box.
I think that obviously, if you don't know what's coming, it's difficult. We've actually seen in the Champions League over the last couple of years, teams like Real Madrid, PSG, and maybe even City take some of these concepts and run with it a little bit, but then they seem to forget it. And the reality is, when you have a really good team and you think that you've got 1 or 2 mismatches that you can create these situations, that's literally what you're looking for in an entire match, right? And so if you know that you get at least 1 kickoff and possibly 2 per game, because maybe you're giving up 1 goal on average, you should do it. It's not a regular situation, but there also might be other spots where you can create this, like any sort of foul, at the midway point or in and around the midway point. You can push your goalkeeper up, you can get a long kick in. Teams used to do this. You get knockdowns. It's not original. It's just, are you able to take advantage of that? And that's something that Brentford are currently, Most teams probably can if they want to put in some training time around it. They just don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember seeing a rudimentary version of this from do you remember Zdeněk Zeman years ago?
Yes,
Yeah.
Zeman seems to do that.
Yeah, he would love everybody sprinting off the halfway line, and it was kamikaze stuff. I kind of loved it.
He was actually in gambling when you were trading games. If he got hired, he was the most important person to know where they went from offseason to offseason, because his team, especially in Italy, would go from like a 2.25 or a 2.5 goal expectation to like a 3.25 in their matches. Like you just knew that you were going to get like 0.75 or even a whole goal added to the total wherever he was coaching at, because they would just be insane. He was happy to play high tempo, high pace. And when he had better players, his teams would end up scoring more goals. Yeah. And then when he had worse players, then they would ship a lot of goals and it would be a bad thing. But that was his philosophy.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you think other teams can learn from this? Okay, obviously the attitude to restarts, but what parts of this do you think are kind of replicable from club to club?
Here's the most insane thing to me. Most teams spend 5 to 10 minutes at most per training session, but sometimes it's 15 minutes per week on set pieces and restarts, right? Set pieces and restarts are something like 40%, 50% of the game if you include the throw-ins. Most of them are not necessarily relevant, but if you can figure out how to make them more relevant or to make them repeatable, to find a little bit of mismatch, to make them a little bit of a part of a pattern of your play, like maybe you can get 5% better as a football team. 5% better as a football team is something you will pay £1 million for a year. Like we will pay a player that's 5% better. Like you do it all the time at the Premier League level or at like sort of the very highest levels. Teams just don't do this, and they should be. And you have to be a little bit obsessive about it, because it is that level of design and attention to detail. But restarts more broadly can be done better across the whole league. And from my personal experience, when you're a good set piece coach, like somebody who's able to get on the grass, do analysis, and pick out the mismatches and teach the players the things that they need to know, you can actually make mid-six figures in a salary, because like a coach as part of a Premier League staff is making that. But the way to think about it, and the way that is often not phrased right, but gets lost, is what would we pay for a player, like a forward that scored 10 more goals a season? 10 more goals a season. Well, on average, a goal in the Premier League is worth about £2.5 million. So you'd be willing to pay something like 25 million, if not more, for that type of player. And actually, somebody that scores 10 more versus your average is going to have a multiple on top of them, because they're the outliers. They're the ones that are most valuable in the whole market.
Sure.
You can bring that back to a coach that makes sort of say 300 to 600, 700,000. That's an awesome piece of arbitrage that doesn't get paid attention to. And then you get sort of the skilled people who can I create people that do long throws? There was this awesome thing from our course. We have this video of Andy Gray and Rob Green and Richard Keys. And I called it like the Flintstones talk about throw-ins.
What a meeting of minds.
So Andy Gray, basically Thomas Gronemark was announced as a coach for Liverpool. And Andy Gray's like, I can't wrap my head around this. Like, it's a throw-in coach. Like maybe I should go and be a throw-in coach. Step 1, pick the ball up in your hands. Step 2, throw it to your teammate. That's it. That's all that you need to learn. And I can't believe that top-level coaches don't know how to do this. Now, that last part may be a little bit true, but the rest part of it is actually not true at all, because, first of all, the long throw concept is difficult to execute. You have to have special technique training to be able to do it. But then there's a whole bunch of things where, what's the biggest difference between a corner, where Arsenal have tons and tons of success, and a long throw from basically the same position on the pitch?
They can deliver the ball at higher speed to the area they want it to go, I assume.
They get to have their head up. You can see what's happening on the pitch, which you cannot do when you have to look down at the ball in order to strike it correctly. And most players still have to be able to do that. So when you have a long throw, you can go more like NFL quarterback, where you can see who's open. And if you start to run plays and routines based off of that, you throw to the open man. Wow, we don't have that ability as a corner, because everybody has to run a preset set of runs in order to make a delivery into a space where we hope we got it right. Unless you screw up your long throw, your delivery is going to be pretty close, within a yard or two. Your corner delivery could be like 5 to 10 out. Like that's
Okay.
like a pretty. So that's number one. The second one is the most insane thing, and it breaks the game. And I swear to God, if people did the stuff that we instruct teams to do on throws, like FIFA would change the rules on it. But what is the most important difference in throws versus free kicks?
But that's what I thought I was saying before. I think I would have said the speed of delivery.
You cannot be offside.
Yeah.
You cannot be offside.
I don't think I'm going to make it as a set piece coach, Ted.
All you have to do is open up people's minds to this, and suddenly they're like, oh my God. Now, what happens if you have fast players and you have somebody that can actually get the ball and throw it, say, 25, 30 meters, even if it's skidding off the ground? You have fast players who cannot be offside, and you can put them into space immediately with your head up. So you've got two players making runs. Which one looks like he's beating his man? That breaks the game. Completely breaks it. Well, there's a couple of concepts that are really high EV that people don't really like us talking about. But the reality is the set pieces one takes a lot of willpower. It takes a lot of expertise. And it takes somebody to get that implemented to the pitch. And most directors of football and head coaches just like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And we have advised them over and over again. I've seen it multiple times. We're like, look, you don't score enough goals to meet what the team has as their goal for the year. And coach, like, I think you're a great coach, but your style of attack is not great at generating stuff. You don't have good enough players to generate goals on your own. You have to have a little bit of a cheat code, and your cheat code is going to be set pieces. If we score an extra 10 goals from set pieces, especially if you get to play in the lead more often, then it'll be great for you. And then so many times it just falls flat. We're good enough. We don't need any help. And then they get fired because they didn't score enough goals. and you're like, look, I didn't want to be the harbinger of doom, but unfortunately it just ended up being true.
Well, it's really fascinating for Brentford to be doing this, given that, we've talked about a bit of a talent drain there in recent seasons, and now they're starting a load of games essentially with a +1 game state. That should be hugely advantageous to them, right, as the season goes on.
Well, it's letting them pilot their way through an injury period too. Like they've had real struggles in midfield, and Johan Wissa has been out too. Norgard is hugely important for them. Like he's probably one of the most important players for any team in the Premier League right now. He played in this match. Wolves were terrible, but these concepts around Brentford set pieces aren't really new, right? Like they've been doing it and being a difficult, bastardy team to face, at least from a restarts perspective, the entire time they've been in the Premier League. It's the only advantage they've had.
Yeah, that's true, actually. When you think about their very first game in the Premier League, it was that Arsenal game, right, where they won 2-0. They crowded the keeper, set-piece goals, worked well for them. And gradually this has been... I wonder if what it's going to take for the whole league to wake up is for... if Arsenal were to win the league this season with an absolute shit ton of set-piece goals again, then maybe that's what everyone will need to wake up to it, because it obviously didn't change anything when when you accidentally destroyed Danish football by introducing set pieces.
I deserve only a tiny bit of credit there. Like the destruction is mostly other people's work. I just helped plot it.
But I mean, look, Ted, as a man of Scandinavian descent, to go back to Scandinavia and wreak such devastation, it's a real act.
The name Knut's son, Viking name meaning chief's son. Maybe I've got some vengeance that needed to be wreaked upon someone's ancestors
to be enacted. Well, okay. Just before we move on from this, we've talked a bit about it from the kind of the club side, but set pieces are an area where I think there are more kind of nonsense truisms bandied around by casual fans than almost anywhere else.
I love these. These are part of my favorite things in football. Tell me more nonsense truisms.
Oh, well, it's just that everybody has this attitude where they're like, look, if somebody were to hit the first man on a corner and I was the coach, they would be immediately dropped. And I always kind of felt like the difference between your perfect corner that just zips over the head of the first man really flat, that Van Persie one, and the one that hits the first man, it's a fraction of an inch. So I'm kind of okay with that rather than just the hopeful lofted ball. But is there something, what would you say the average fan could benefit from thinking about when they watch set pieces? Is there any kind of principle that they could have in mind?
There's a couple of clues. One is, are they doing anything a little weird before the corner is actually taken.
Mhm.
That is like almost immediately clear that like somebody has something going on. And our perspective on these was always either I want them to think they know what's going to happen and do something entirely different, or I want them to have no idea what's going to happen and have to make all these decisions on the fly as to how to defend it. Like those situations, even for professional players, are really, really difficult to handle. So that was our perspective from it. So if you're a fan and you're watching Arsenal's set pieces in particular, they're the most obvious about it right now. But there are other teams in the league that are good and that spend time on this. In fact, one of the things that Liverpool did was they worked really well on set pieces. They had lots of goals from it in the times when they were getting into the 90+ point space. Even the season that they had the slip, like they had a ton of set piece goals that year. And so they were good at that too. But if you see people standing up in weird spots, or if they're clustered together in funny ways, you're like, that's interesting. I'm going to pay attention to that. Beyond that, like it's a little bit about like how much space are you running into? Like you want to create overloads and underloads. The whole of football is about overloads and underloads. This just happens to be from a restart. And so you want to create overloads and underloads. One of the key plays that you do that is by creating space. Like the absence of space or the crowding of space is the concept that you're working with here all the time. And so that's another bit. Like if your team is often creating a huge vacuum of space, watch that space for what happens, because usually it's sleight of hand that things are going over here, but we're creating the absence of space to be able to execute. And those corners that Arsenal do where they've got runners from the backside, they're running to the near post. What that does is it forces a lot of attention to that near post. But where they're taking advantage of it is either from a central run or a far post run. And now they've got one of their best headers in the team that has a 1v1 isolation, potentially a 0v1 isolation, and he's just free. That's the other thing you're trying to create too. Can we create free headers in the box or free kicks with feet in the box? Because some short corner routines are really to create the absence of space where someone runs into that space and then gets a shot. Like those are the really big things that you're looking for.
That's really interesting. Something else has just occurred to me. I said that would be the last question, but when you're talking here about the way we're kind of interpreting space, and also when you were mentioning before Red Bull kind of kicking, getting throws, and then pressing really aggressively, is this an area where football has been most influenced by other sports, do you think? Because that to me, kicking for territory in that way, that sounds to me like rugby. And when we're talking about the way space can be manipulated on the field, obviously in the past we've heard Pep talk about this, and he's got his water polo guys and everything. Is this something that's going on?
Yeah, I think that it is, and I think that this is the biggest area where like the NBA is able to, or sorry, the NFL is able to help. So I think of these spaces as American sports in my brain, and so NFL style routines are key. Like these are the players, these are the routes that they run, and in American football, cornerbacks, CBs in my brain, cornerbacks are trained their whole lives to be able to cover wide receivers wherever they go. And they're small and they're incredibly agile, or they're medium-sized, they're incredibly agile, and they're really, really fast. And even when they've trained their whole lives to be able to do this, it's still really hard, and wide receivers get open all the time. Now, this is in that sport. What if we did similar things over in this sport? And the reality is, like, nobody even knows how to defend this yet, and we're very early in this era. And if you did throw-ins more in sort of a higher EV way, or a way that's more likely to get players open all the time, then you create real problems that teams will have to study more and adapt to. Corners are a little bit easier to defend because there's only so much space. But if you're working in basically from the middle third into the final third, like that's a lot of space to be able to defend, and it's hard to figure out how to do that correctly when everything's in motion. So that's kind of the way. The next thing that I always looked at, so set pieces restarts are NFL based, but then it feels like final third attacking is NBA based. And NBA teams walk down the pitch, they have the moment where they've got the ball, and that player is sort of like in space and not immediately aggressively pressed or things like that. Feels like you can run routines off of that in the final third, even if it's just one or two options for the player to look at. If neither of those is open, then recycle possession and try and set up again. If one of those is open, then execute that, like hopefully vertically into the box, and then create a good shot or a good chance from that space. But those are kind of the two ways that I feel other sports, at least on the American side, really apply to football, and is very nascent in how teams are still executing, but it's still available to them to sort of have first mover advantage.
Well, I'd be really intrigued to see how this develops kind of over the next few years. Every now and then, one of these stories comes out about a manager who's gone and spoken to a rugby coach or whoever it might be, or an ice hockey coach or something. So I wonder what else we'll see over the next 10 years. Shall we move on from Brentford? Shall we move on from restarts? Because I found a tweet, some clown on Twitter said, we're approaching short goal kick equilibrium in the Premier League, where enough teams are good at pressing that there's real risk reward involved in playing out the back. Are you about to defend this person, Ted?
It was me, so probably.
It was you. But it's certainly something that's happening right now. So tons of goals this season off high turnovers. Feels like teams are getting caught constantly, sometimes multiple times in different ways in the same game. Chelsea Brighton, I'm thinking of particularly here. What do you think is going on here?
So we're going to bring basketball back into this, and I apologize for the name drop, but there's a guy named Daryl Morey who used to spend a lot more time on Twitter, and he likes football, and he would see like all these short goal kicks and stuff. And this is like way back in like 17, 18. He's like, this is insane. This can't make any sense. And why are teams keep passing backwards? Like, this is nonsense. Don't pass backwards. Like, you've got territorial advantage. Like, what are you trying to even do? And we had to try and talk to him. And like, Daryl, well, you're trying to create the right amount of space and you're trying to create overloads. And it's a lot bigger than a basketball pitch or field and court. and so, you're trying to move teams around so that you can then move them forward. And he's like, feels like nonsense. If they just press them more aggressively, like you'd be able to get stuff off of these passes back to the goalkeeper and potentially score more goals. And then the short goal kick happened. And we really got this like beautiful experimental space to see whether teams were going to start to aggressively press off of short restarts effectively, which is what a goal kick in a dangerous area of territory. Now, what we will see, and this is like, it's like two sides fighting for bias here, in that one side will show you the teams that play out beautifully and they bypass like 6 guys on the way to go towards the other end. And then there's some beautiful team goal that took 22 passes across the entirety of the pitch. And you're like, oh, that is football at its finest. And then you see the other people are like, yeah, except for what happened with Chelsea, where like, they blew them up twice and they got 2 free goals effectively. And you're like, that to me is football. That's rock and roll style football. And I love rock and roll football. That's sort of where I really started to enjoy stuff. So we saw short goal kicks happen. We saw positive expectation from short goal kicks consistently, where it's better to start the ball short so you maintain possession and you're able to move the ball up the pitch, because really on a long goal kick, you only have about a 55, maybe 60% chance of retaining the ball. So like, yeah, this is useful. Having the ball versus not having the ball, it's useful to give up some territoriality until the whole system moves towards you. And now you have no great places to go short. So either you have to go long up over the top where they're likely to get the ball back, or if you make a mistake, then they feast. And the feasting, it's so delicious. I love a feast. A feast off of a short goal kick where you press everybody. And we have seen it more and more where it's a very difficult thing to do. These Premier League players are so fast and they are so good at seeing the pressing triggers that this year it finally feels like they are making teams pay across the board if you're ready to do the short goal kick. Now, part of that may be the fact that lots of teams do it. So now that lots of teams do it, like, you will prepare for it and you will know how to react and you will set that system in play. It's a bit like when it was only Big Sam and Tony Pulis playing set pieces, teams didn't really have to adapt as much because like you didn't have to face these giants all the time. And it was just, 4 times a year you'd have to play them. Once you got 4 teams that were really aggressively loading the boxes with giant men that were going to try and hammer the ball down and stuff like that, then Arsenal had to do things like literally play 4 center backs across the back in order to sort of stop that and protect against what felt like easy goals. Now Arsenal happened to be the team doing that, and PSG are the ones who like, this is unfair. Like our players are normal size. Like what happened here? So that's my take on sort of what's happened. And it is this fascinating experimental space where you see teams that are able to press. You see it happening all the time now. And finally, they're taking advantage of it and blowing stuff up.
So just to put some numbers on it as well, like if you look 3 years ago, like the median passes per defensive action for Premier League teams, it was about 12.5. Now it's 11. So pressing a bit more aggressively. Median tackles in the final third 3 years ago was about 2.1 a game for a Premier League side, and now it's like 2.7. So we're looking at kind of a 30% increase. So that's a huge difference over a relatively short time, right? Do we expect the pendulum to swing back? Are big guys going to come back into vogue? Obviously Arsenal, like maybe Arsenal are ahead of the curve. Maybe it's by coincidence, maybe it's by design. But now you've got Marino and Havertz. You could just knock it over the pressing line and you're through.
It's exactly right. Chris Wood, new Nottingham Forest goal this weekend, and also came off so that was a set piece goal. It came off of hitting it to, I think, Milinkovic, who's another giant. And so like giant to giant sort of set up on mismatches. But yes, we had talked for quite a while of having kind of a big man or two big men. Sometimes it's a leaper that is going to be a mismatch out wide. But those were your options for being able to play forward out of the back on the long ball. And there is like an ebb and flow and equilibrium of cycles that go through this where teams want fast, small guys. Well, that's also pretty good as long as somebody can knock the ball to them and get the ball through, right? And so we'll actually talk about this in our German discussion in just a minute about player who we saw it with Adama this weekend as well. Like Traore was just on the races and had 2 1v1s with Ederson where he hit right at him, which is sort of the amazing Adama Traore experience. But he got 1v1. They knew that he was going to be isolated. In one case, it was against, was it Rico? And the other one, and the other one was
Kyle Walker.
Yes, him.
Yeah.
I wrote about him and I forgot his name. Both of these things are options. The big man play is probably the more reliable one, especially if you think that they have options off of them. Like, that you've got midfield options or you're playing in a space where you've got your wide forward option there and then a quick drop to either the DM or the fullback on the side. You have to create new options. And the more optionality you have in football, the more different ways you can play, the harder it is for teams to shut you down in plan A or plan B. If you only have plan A and they lock you down, it's just an awful experience, and it reflects some of the terrible games that we see in the Premier League. Although I feel like we're seeing more fast break games than we have in recent times. Like just seeing a lot of transition goals.
Yeah. Does this mean then, and I think it was maybe James York who said this on Twitter, that there is an advantage to be gained from teams who adjust to this earlier than others? So, well, whether it's Chris Wood or something, or even, West Ham could bring in Sucic, I guess, if they wanted, like that sort of thing. Do you think that the teams that kind of adapt to this faster could maybe get some points before people adjust?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think every season is some adjustment. I think especially when you're in the meaty part of the early season, like games are coming pretty fast. Like the big teams have had all these midweeks. The other teams should be trying to figure out, like, what do we do to throw them off, right? Because they don't really have time to scout as well. So can we create one additional wrinkle in our game plan that is hard for them to handle? And preparation is always a complaint that you hear from coaches all the time, especially teams that are in Europe. And now you've got the Conference League where they still have to play. Like Chelsea magically get to just like put 11 other players out there. But like most of the teams have to have some level of subs and some rotation.
So maybe in combination with the congested schedule, this might be an area where we see some of this quote unquote smaller teams getting an edge over the bigger ones. And actually, that does kind of lead on to our German discussion, as you were saying. So Bayern Munich coming off an extremely funny 1-0 defeat to Aston Villa with a really horrible fixture, away game at Frankfurt. And Frankfurt, for those who don't know, are now coached by Dino Topmüller, who was an assistant to Nagelsmann at Bayern and at Leipzig. And last season, they were kind of about even XG and XG against, but they really, really kicked on this year. Their XG difference puts them in that top pack of, I think it's about 5 at the moment. Bayern, Leverkusen, Stuttgart, and Freiburg, which is kind of fun. Notable absentees: Dortmund and Leipzig. And in this game, they were heavily outshot, but they gave Bayern
24-6.
24-6. But the 6 shots that they got, Ted, I would say good shots to get.
It also helps when one of your players is doing their Thierry Henry impression, which I feel like Omar Marmoush actually is doing a pretty accurate representation there.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember the summer? I don't know how much you were paying attention to it, but the transfer market had a very interesting, well-sourced rumor that Marmoush was going to go to Spurs. And one of the sources of that rumor was Mito, like ex-Spurs, ex-Middlesbrough. And when it comes to Egyptian players, Mito is definitely in the know. Like Mito knows everybody knows Mito, whatever. So I was pretty sure that he was going to move. Spurs probably kicking themselves that they didn't get that done, because that price is way higher than it would have been. But you couldn't have predicted that he would be doing what he is right now. So he's in the 98th percentile of expected goals, 0.61 per game right now, and he's in the 99th percentile of expected goals assisted. So he's also like fully willing to create for his teammates, and he's so fast.
He's so fast.
We saw him winning races and like catching up and passing players on players that he should not. It doesn't feel like he should be that fast. And he was just whooshing right past. So this is another one of those cases where you have a highline team, which is Bayern and Vince and Kompany, and they are controlling so much of the game. But there is that fragility, that counterpuncher's fragility against the highline team if you have pace. The best player in the world for about 5 seasons at breaking this, former Arsenal player, also played in Germany, wore a Spider-Man mask occasionally. Yeah, so Aubameyang was just unbelievable at people playing him into space. And he had scalps that he took off of Bayern when they were playing this style too. Sure. Now it's Marmoush that's able to do it. Frankfurt, I always feel like they should be a bit bigger and a bit better. To me, I feel like this is a team that it's really huge city. Obviously, it's one of the hotbeds of German football in general, and they have had some pretty good coaches over the year. Like Adi Hütter, I think, was there for a bit too.
Yeah.
But yeah, Marmoush was incredible, and Bayern felt like they had control of this a couple of different times. It felt like they were just really done. Olisa was like a total handful on the right hand side. But yeah, these breakdowns in Marmoush's Jets just made this game way more even than it was. 3 goals off of 6 shots is a pretty good return on a day.
Yeah, but I mean, when I looked at the game, I was just like, okay, 6 shots, fine. But 0.25 XG on average per shot. This is, I mean, you when you go to watch the highlights, you will see exactly what you expect to see. That is 72-point font saying the defense got broken. What's weird is what you're saying, which is that Bayern were 3-2 up in the 52nd minute. The first half had been insanity. And you'd have thought that Bayern would just kind of adopt their kind of smothering approach that's worked pretty well for them this season, that they play a bit more conservatively, drop a little bit more. But they didn't. Bayern didn't really do anything after they scored, whereas Frankfurt in the last 10 minutes got 2 huge chances against a defense that was incredibly high up. Does this make you revise down your opinion of Bayern's defense at all? Because also the Villa game, I've got to say, there were times in the Villa game where somebody got into space between the midfield line and the defensive line. And fortunately for Bayern, it was mostly Ross Barkley, who for some reason had put on his clown shoes and just couldn't pick a pass that night. I thought he was horrible when he came on. But he was in space where they would be worried to see him, right?
So Vincent Kompany's still new. And this is something that I feel Pep solved that people in Pep's style may not solve. How much fun are City matches to watch after they go 2-0 up against anybody that they're slightly scared of? It is the worst experience in the world. Like, what happens is they're going to pass it 400 times. Like, 1 or 2 of those is going to be slightly dangerous. If the opponent gets the ball and tries to break, there's certainly a tactical foul. And in fact, like, I think we saw multiple yellows at the end of the recent City game from tactical fouling, delays, whatever. Like, you talk about dark arts. Tactical fouling is the best, most consistent dark art that there is. and actually, teams have been doing this for 20 some odd years. Like Mourinho used to coach all of his forwards to rotate tactical fouls amongst themselves. And, you've got a yellow over here. Well, don't get another one unless you like absolutely must, but make sure that you break up every possible counterattack. City fans are used to this. I think Kompany has not gotten bit enough, and his team is a little bit arrogant in their dominance, but they need to figure out how to really just bleed all of the air out of the games when they're leading with this style, because it's still just that little bit fragile. And so unless you take real efforts in order to kill it, like you can get bit like this. And they got bit multiple times off of the exact same problems. And I think that when you saw against Aston Villa was still, it's like the early reps of a manager that has a great style and a great set of personnel, but hasn't quite figured out to game manage the tactic side.
Mm-hmm. How hard would it be though for Kompany to learn that, given that there are relatively few teams that are going to have the horses to kind of to trouble them in this way?
You should just never allow good chances after you 2-0 up, right? I mean, Arsenal do this a bit too. Like, the only thing that saves Arsenal is like they're willing to do really good set pieces at the back end of games, but they just don't let teams do anything dangerous to them at 2-0. Like they mid block more, I think, than most teams of this particular style. I think when you see them pushed way up, and the German guys love this, right? They grew up in this style. Like this style is now like almost officially the German team style. Nagelsmann, to a lesser extent, coached more of a possession-based style, and I think he is better at being able to generate attacks, a little more practical in some of his approaches to stuff. But I think overall, like, it will take time. He'll probably do some research, talk about it. Like they'll figure it out before the end of the season, but we're still pretty early. Like 24 shots to 6 against the second or best or third best team in Germany at home is still super dominant.
Yeah. I think it was 2.8 to 1.5 XG, something like that as well. I don't know. I mean, when you've got a Pamecano in your backline and people are running at him, that is a recipe for entertainment. I don't know. Maybe we see Alphonso Davies turning into the next kind of the Kyle Walker shutdown, as you were talking before about cornerbacks, like that kind of player. That might be kind of interesting. Okay, so shall we leave Bayern there? And we've got a bit more time. I'm going to offer you a choice, Ted. Would you rather talk about Spurs? Very funny. Or talk about Manchester City? Interesting question marks.
Maybe we should talk, and I know that you and Ravi will talk about a bunch of this, but we've talked about Real Madrid and their summers and how they've been kind of like pulling the transfer market behind them towards them a little bit. That is going to change in the same way that City went very light in this most recent transfer market, and they're going to have to spend in January too. So Carvajal went down with an ACL.
Yeah.
They renewed him in sort of a goodwill gesture of faith. They were going to do it anyway, but they pushed that through after he went down and blew his ACL. Fullbacks are a big deal right now, and they're a big deal for teams that want to be able to, you want bigger ones that can do exactly what you talk about with Kyle Walker, which is still be able to clean things up from the back. Maybe they're a third center back out wide. You can push them. They're really comfortable in possession most of the time, so you can invert them if you need to. But as needed, you can also kind of also make them wing backs in situations where you need to be high up. Maybe you're chasing the game. They're often one of the more talented crossing groups that you have. Not perfect, but they still are able to get to the byline. They've learned that. With City, with these groups, like they weren't spending, and now they've had injuries where they have to. And we've seen January be quite a quiet transfer month for a long time. But I think the other thing Real Madrid have realized is that they are missing a Kroos. And so on Wednesday on the newsletter, I'm going to dig into Kroos likes. And what was interesting is like early in the summer, I dug into the data and looked for Kimmich-likes. And the kid that sort of had the most interesting comps that I had never, ever heard of, and actually no one had talked about him. He didn't even have like a highlight reel, was Petar Sucic from Dino Zagreb, who happened to score in the Champions League just this past week. So you're like, that was good timing. Seems like, and they had just signed him up to a long term, I think in April. And I was like, oh, people missed the boat on that one, because he's going to be a lot more expensive than he was. So we're going to look at Kroos likes in the newsletter coming up. The other thing that we kind of talk about compilations. Somebody out there, I think it was like Kimmo FC, and oh man, it's so frustrating with the Premier League and their highlight packages. Like in other sports in America, fans share everything all the time, and you get to live off the back of it, and you get to see all the cool highlights and stuff like that. There was an amazing comp of Spurs center backs and Udogie, and particularly Van de Ven, who just had the worst second half that I can remember of players that seemed to be in pretty good control in the first half. And it's not that this is unusual for Spurs, but like when you're just a step slow the entire time against somebody else's defense or somebody else's attack, it just feels like bad things are going to happen. Did you watch that game and watch all the bad things?
I did watch that game. I did watch all the bad things. With Van de Ven, I guess it was one of those things where I was kind of thinking, is this a guy who can rely on his incredible athleticism, or is this just a bad day? Like it's kind of hard to work that out. But the way that he was kind of shaken off, or the way that he would overcommit to challenges, it was quite alarming to see, because Spurs should have been out of sight in that game.
It's another one where you're up 2-0. Like the best teams put that one to bed, and Spurs did nothing to put that baby to bed. The baby was awake. It was crying. Like you couldn't get it to go to sleep. It was scoring at the far post off of missed clearances. It was barging your two center backs off of the ball into each other so that you could get an open shot in the middle of the box. It's not to just pick on Van de Ven though. Calafiori had a couple times where he got burnt this weekend. Arsenal fans are in love with Calafiori, partly when your center back / fullback scores goals, he's beautiful. I remember this with Thomas Vermaelen. Like you remember this with Jan Vertonghen. Like it just got this extra love affair. But part of playing in the Premier League now is like this razor's edge of commitment. And if you are overcommitting against explosive players, they will just light the whole pitch on fire as they burn away from you. And Van de Ven, who is very fast, but maybe needs to be a little more cautious in how he's playing. Maybe that's part of an instruction. Maybe it's more high press so that they don't get opportunity to be on the ball. But Brighton's ball players, especially with a little bit of spacing adjustment in that second half, like they had tons of time and space. And man, Mitoma had such beautiful passes in and around the box in that game. And they know that he's dangerous, but he's good enough that it doesn't matter.
Oh my God, I love him. He's a very similar player to Bukayo Saka, in my opinion. Just on the other side, he could do that progressive carrying, but he has the pass selection that you would just expect from a central player, I guess. Like obviously that's a type that we've seen grow, but he was really running that game in the second half. I mean, the win still took. I do think we have to talk about this. That the Welbeck winner, the tackle cross, is so unbelievable that I beg anyone who hasn't seen it to go and look it up.
There were 2 assists this weekend that you must watch if you like football at all.
Oh my God.
This was one of them. And Jimenez was the other one. I just got all the hairs on my arms because that was unbelievable.
Yeah, it's bananas. It's like Berbatov-esque. It's incredible. I actually know you likened it to Guti, didn't you?
Yeah, it's a back heel in the box, except for against Petar on the break, which was the Guti one. He's out here on the corner against Manchester City, and it's just like just this amazing lofted one. But to go back to yours one, like Reuters is just as good and possibly a higher degree of difficulty on the finish, much higher actually.
I genuinely cannot believe it, and I'm really delighted as well that Danny Welbeck is kind of in phenomenal form right now. Like a player that we've talked about before, player I've always loved, super intelligent guy, an underrated passer as well. Like he's a good passer for a centre forward. He's not going to like split defenses, but he's a good kind of retention player, and just
he was beloved by his teammates too. Like when he'd come back to visit Arsenal, like Arsenal had to let him go because he's injured, and to some extent, like Manchester United let him go because he couldn't maintain a run of form. So when this type of player who is smart and you've kind of rooted for is actually having that run of form, and it'll end eventually because like these things don't last. It's just like, just appreciate it. And that was what this weekend really was. There were so many elements across so many different games that you could appreciate. It was great to be a fan. It was nice to have an Arsenal win on top of that. I'm sure Spurs are feeling a little less great to be a fan, but the only thing that wasn't great this weekend, I think, was the horrible Aston Villa versus Manchester United game. That game was awful. We're not even going to talk about it other than to say it was horrible. And yeah, don't even bother watching the highlights of that.
Yeah, but then obviously don't watch that one. Why would you do that to yourself? But even, Chelsea Forest 1-1 doesn't look like it would be a barn burner. Everyone should check that out too if you're a fan of goalkeeping. It's like 15 saves in that game.
Yeah, those kind of, 15 saves. You're right. It was like 17 shots on target, 9-8 is what it was, and then only a 1-1 game. And yeah, those guys like grew extra arms. It was just, and they like Cole Palmer had a double chance there that feels like 90% of the time that kid just finishes it and it's done. In this moment, like just double save there. There's also a brawl, which how can you not appreciate a brawl? And people then like focused on Palmer's like response, where he just sort of like sat down, waited for everybody else to get done with the pushing and the shoving. But that's actually the right choice for him. He's like, no, I'm not gonna. Like, there's no reason for me to get involved in this. I'm just gonna hang out back here, stay out of trouble. It's important for me to be on the pitch. Chelsea's defense is worrying.
Yeah,
their attack worries everybody else. But they're in fourth. And yeah, Unai Emery's producing games that are horrific to watch, even against Manchester United, who everybody has run through the entire time. So they feel like they're favorites for fourth right now. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's not far off.
I mean, it does defy logic, though, that the 0-0 game this weekend was a game in which the two midfields were Mainu Eriksson and Barkley Tielemans. Like, genuinely zero defensive presence across the two, and somehow it ended 0-0. Incredible. Taking another beating, Ted.
I lost the half bet on that one. I got pushed into it because of the models. I had a winning weekend this weekend, so that was nice. But that sucked. Look, it's been a really good period. I'm not sure what we'll talk about next week. Maybe we'll figure that out. But I think that this has been one of the more fun Premier League seasons out of the gate that I have seen. We have three contenders who all have their own like minor fragilities, but who also are right there. So yeah, really good.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much to everybody who's watching or listening for joining us this week. Please make sure that you do follow the Transfer Flow on our social media platforms, and that you are reading the newsletter, which is absolutely fantastic and will keep you going with top quality football content through the international break. Please let us know what you'd like to see us discuss. You can reply to the Transfer Flow podcast on Twitter, or you can send me a message, I guess. That would be a good way to do it too. And obviously, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening or watching, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.